something I keep forgetting to mention, even though it's the CIA. The CIA was founded in the late 1940s as an attempt to fight communism. There was a fear that we were being infiltrated, where the CIA still looks into communism, but now it's more designed to try to fight terrorism. The CIA still exists. There was a move on in the 1960s to abolish the CIA, that it wasn't necessary, but the CIA goes all over the world and tries to recruit spies and pays people to inform on other people. And it's difficult to get a Muslim to inform on a Muslim, though. I mean, I'll say this, and I mean this is maybe as a compliment to Islam, but Muslims do not generally inform on other Muslims. That's difficult to do, but we try to get communists to inform on other communists and try to get people to inform and get people whom we know have been hurt. Now, they warned us when I was at Lockheed how that the enemy would try to get you if they could. They'd find out if you'd been passed over for promotion. And he's vulnerable. He just got passed over for a promotion. And they'd come in and they'd sympathize with you, and before you know it, you'd revealed a big secret to them. Then eventually at that point, they owned you. Because you had to keep revealing more and more secrets, and eventually you get caught. All right, the next chapter opens up. Now, from here on, folk, beginning with chapter 27, we're going to be talking about events that I personally remember, even though it's different reading about them now because we tended to look on these things a lot differently back then. But I remember the kitchen debates. Vice President Nixon, who hoped to be the next president, as you may know, he eventually got to be president, but not the next one. But Vice President Nixon went to Russia, to the Soviet Union, and he carried with him an American kitchen. The American kitchen had a range, a refrigerator, an electric stove, and a refrigerator, and a dishwasher, and a garbage collector, and all these things that most American women did have in their kitchens. And Khrushchev was painfully aware that most people in the Soviet Union were living 2 or 3 families per apartment or per household. The Soviet Union had a shortage of housing, so they'd crowd 2 or 3 families together in the same house. Everything was crowded. And Nixon was showing off this nice new refrigerator and said, you know, we have a lot of homes have 2 of these, and showing off the radio that most Americans had at that time. They'd have them in their kitchen. And Khrushchev just blew up. Angrily blew up and started a big tirade that included a whole lot of cussing that made the interpreter blush. Nixon was really surprised, taken aback. The heated exchange is known as the kitchen debate. Eventually, both men apologized. Nixon said he had not meant to offend. Nixon took his American kitchen and came back to the United States, ran for president, lost, ran again a couple more times and won. In 1952, the country elected Dwight Davidson Eisenhower as president. Now, we've seen his name before. Harry Truman realized that Eisenhower was unbeatable and he refused to run against Ike. The Democrats could not find him. Ike was just altogether too popular, having helped us win World War II. So, Ike became the president, and Ike was to be president for the next 8 years. Ike's 1952 campaign went really smoothly, but late in the campaign he had one glitch. It involved his vice president, Nixon. Nixon had been found to have had stored away 18,000 pre-inflation dollars, which back then was a lot of money. That was campaign money that he had stored away. He said, oh, this money was to help fellow Republicans. He called it a slush fund, in case we run short. We finally decided the slush fund was legal, but it was, all right, folks, it was like it was on the edge, tottering on the edge between legality and illegality. It looked suspicious. Nixon was able to worm his way out of that by getting in front of the TV and giving a speech. At the end of the speech, he just broke down and boo-hooed. He said, if I have taken anything from anyone, I'll be happy to give it back, but there's one thing I won't give back, and I won't give back a dog that was given to my little girls, a dog named Checkers, and at that point he just broke down and bawled in front of the TV. The people who expressed a lot of sympathy, they started sending telegrams and letters to Ike, don't dump him, don't dump him. From that day though on forward, Ike and Nixon did not have a whole lot to do with each other, even though Ike really wanted Nixon to be the next president over Kennedy. But that was the one glitch in Ike's 1952 campaign, but Ike was strong enough to overcome it. Ike was a man who, like a typical general, had a lot of political advisors around him, and his advisors said, don't dump him, it'll hurt you, won't it help you. Keep him on the ticket. Ike listened to his advisors. Nixon was kept on a ticket. Ike did not repeal the New Deal, but he did not expand on it. Now here's where your book takes a liberal turn. I mean, well, actually it becomes more and more liberal all the time. It acts like the socialistic legislation is wonderful, and the presidents who do it are great, and the ones who don't are less than great. And when Ike left office, 8 years later, he was looked on as being a very mediocre president. But as time went on, he became better and better looking, owing to the fact that we went through Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs, Johnson and Vietnam, Nixon and Watergate, Ford and inflation, Carter and more inflation. By the time we went through the next 5 presidents, Ike was looking better and better all the time. But he started off, actually at the end of his term, being looked on as being a very mediocre president. Ike did not want aid to education. He did not want to end racial desegregation. Basically, you might say by today's standards, Ike was a racist. The one thing he did, though, that you'll see every time you get on an interstate, you'll see 5 stars, and they call it the Eisenhower Interstate System. Ike had been to Germany during the war, and he's seen Hitler's 4-lane roads, Hitler's superhighways. Now, if you know anything about Germany's autobahns, they'll go straight. I mean, they're straight as an arrow for miles. Then they warn you when they're about to turn, and you can go, and no speed limit. You can go 150 miles an hour if you want to. You've seen it. No speed limit. Just zoom along as fast as your car can go. But when you come to a turn, they warn you beginning about 2 miles before there's a turn. You slow your car down, make the turn, then you zoom it again and how fast your car can go. But Ike did not want that in this country, so our turnpikes, superhighways, call them what you will, are not straight. And we do have speed limits, which are enforced. But anyway, he's remembered for his interstate highway system. Now, here's where your book says, folk, and again, I can hardly agree with the authors less. He talks like these highways were bad because they made more energy consumption, more pollution, decline in mass transportation. I want to tell you something, folks, if you don't already know this. The cheapest way to travel by car is on a superhighway. And traveling at 65 miles an hour on a freeway uses less gas than traveling at 35 miles an hour in stop-and-go traffic. Nothing is more expensive than to have to stop and go, stop and go, stop and go. On the expressway, you get up to 65 and you can cruise at that speed. The disease of polio was spreading again, and Eisenhower did get government money to vaccinate everybody against polio. Yes, I had 3 polio shots. The way you did it, you got a shot 1 month, then a month later, 30 days later, you got your second shot. Then you waited 7 months and got your 3rd shot. That was in the days of the needle. Then, of course, somebody named Jonas Salk developed the oral vaccine where you take it by tablets and get immunized by an oral, a tablet through the mouth. When I became president, one of the first things he did was get us out of the Korean War. The Korean War ended. It did not really end in a peace treaty. It's just he got the North Koreans to agree to a truce. And the truce has been going on ever since. The truce was signed in 1953 by both sides. The Korean War is still going on, folk. But both sides have agreed for the last 60 years to quit fighting. He got McCarthy discredited. He did try to get Indian tribes off the reservations. And folk, your book says that oftentimes it was devastating the Indians. I mean, just uprooting the Indians from their way of life. The Indians were trying to live the only way of life they knew, out in the open fields with teepees over their heads, and hunting and fishing, or growing small gardens. And it was difficult to get them to adopt the white man's ways. As is true of just about all modern presidents, Eisenhower won the election of 1956, but even though he himself won, the Republicans lost badly in the House and Senate. The Democrats made huge gains in the House and Senate. Now, there was still a lot of poverty going on, particularly in rural areas. I've told you, on a personal note, I myself grew up in poverty. Oh, yes, I was one of the 1/3 of American children in the 1950s was growing up in poverty. When you grow up in poverty, thinking you're the only one, everybody else has more money than you, everybody is richer than you. But then you realize there were some people who were even worse off than I was. I recall when I was in the Army, a man who'd been in the Army before said, no matter how badly you think you have it, there's always somebody around you who's having it worse. In most cases, that's true. Somebody around you is having it worse than you are. Ike tried to build up nuclear weapons, but, and here's what had given Eisenhower a bad name. This, the first historical event that I remember, folks, was Eisenhower's heart attack. It occurred in 1955 when I was 6 years old, and of course Ike had a heart attack. In those days, doctors did not quite know how to handle them as well as doctors do today. But Eisenhower was taken to Walter Reed Hospital, and everybody wondered, was he going to make it or not? He did make it. But the other event I remember was in 1956, Hungary, the nation of Hungary, revolted against the Soviet Union. They believed that if they revolted, the United States would come to help. Eisenhower refused to give the Hungarians aid and let Hungary be crushed. This was one of the things that gave Ike a bad name. But a lot of persons say that Ike had seen war. He had heard the hideous screams, he'd seen the broken bodies, he'd seen the young men torn apart, permanently disfigured, permanently damaged, and he vowed that he was going to do everything he could to stop a war. When Hungary revolted, he did not help the Hungarians out. Hungary made a lot of news at the time. Again, this made the United States look weak, and a popular saying at the time was, America will not be pushed around. So Ike refused to go to war to help the Hungarians. Ike also refused to help the Vietnamese. When when Vietnam revolted against France, the French appealed to the United States for help. Ike did not give the French troops or planes. Vietnam was divided. You may know that we wound up involved in a 12-year-long war in Vietnam, but not during Eisenhower's watch. Now, south of the border, and folk, this is something that went on for generations in Latin America. In Guatemala, the people of Guatemala elected a president that the United States did not like. So the United States overthrew the elected president and installed a dictatorship. Now, yes, you're hearing me right, where the United States overthrew an elected official and installed a dictatorship. What? Okay. That is an extremely good question. I'm glad you asked it. Essentially, here's what, now, folk, we discussed it in high school. A lot of these countries were not ready for democracy, and this is something Woodrow Wilson did not understand. That only a few people in this world have been able to make a democracy actually work for any length of time. It takes a self-restrained people. Most people throughout history have functioned better when there's one man in charge, either a king or an absolute monarch or an emperor or a dictator. Most people function better under those conditions, and Latin America was a prime example. Now today, I mean, jumping ahead, we have democracies in Latin America. And the gangs are taking over and the young gangs run the place. And even the politicians get permission from teenage gang people before they move. And that's why a lot of people flee to the United States because, I mean, there's one American worker who sends his mother $80 a week from his paycheck, $80 a week to Latin America. And she has to give 20 of that every week to the gang to keep the gang off her back. It's like a tax.
So Mexico should have a dictator. Something, right?
Hey, folks, what I'm about to say, I don't like what I'm saying. The Philippines did better under a dictator. Singapore. All right, when Singapore got its independence, I believe from Great Britain, it got to where if you lived in the land of Singapore, you had better collect 8 or 10 armed men with you before just to walk to the grocery store. Today, in the land of Singapore, the women can take a stroll in a park at night with their babies. Because a dictator took over, and he practiced the practice called caning, where the offender was beaten by a martial arts expert with a heavy cane. And the people of Singapore loved it. He went, oh, they like, yes, because the bad people. He only killed a few people who deserved to be killed. I'm talking about Liu Yan, the Singapore dictator. He only punished the people who deserved to be punished. Your honest, upright citizen had nothing to fear from him and also had nothing to fear from the gangs anymore. He quashed the gangs. And the people of Singapore loved him. After 20 or so years, he retired in peace. Marcos in the Philippines took over and did the same thing. And right now in the Philippines, we have a dictator who said, I'm going to destroy the gangs, and he's doing it. And recently in Brazil, they elected a new president in Brazil, and this president said, if a policeman kills a bad man, he's not going to be fired. I'm going to reward that policeman. And said, furthermore, I'm going to take these criminals and put them on a ship and anchor the ship several miles offshore where they can't swim back. And the people of Brazil seem to love him. What am I saying? I mean, hey, I don't like what I'm saying either, folk, if you don't like it. But sometimes it takes a firm, tough hand to tell these gangsters, you either straighten up, you're going to take the consequences. And you have to be tougher than they are. We trained a bunch of policemen, Latin American policemen, and guess what? The policemen are fleeing the country. They fear for their own lives. The policemen's hands are tied. The gangsters, their hands aren't tied. They can kill anybody they want to and get away with it. Anybody, I mean, I see you're listening, I appreciate it. Anybody else have any comments? Your comments are welcome. I don't think you like what I'm saying, but I don't like it either. Again, we gave these countries freedom. And they elected officials who couldn't keep order. And the United States actually supported a dictator in Latin America. And more we started supporting dictators. And my teacher in high school, Mr. Woodman, said, you have to support these dictators because only the dictators can keep order. Now, folks, we're going to talk next class about Saddam Hussein. Oh, he was a bad one. We got rid of him. I had a young girl ask me, she was from the Middle East, were things better off after Saddam Hussein left, or did things get worse? If someone were to ask you that, what answer could you give? I'm talking about Iraq now. Were things better off in Iraq with Saddam Hussein in power than they were after he left?
I think so.
They were better off with Saddam Hussein in power. Yes, he kept order.
Especially
with Saddam Hussein gone, ISIS came in, and Al-Qaeda came in, that Saddam Hussein would not have tolerated.
Then why did we fight Saddam in the first place?
We'll get into that, but we accused them of having weapons of mass destruction and accused them of aiding terrorism.
Yeah, we didn't find any of it, right?
Well, I'm going to have to say we did find the weapons of mass destruction, which we denied. The New York Times reported we found cache after cache of old corroded weapons of mass destruction, and 600 American servicemen were injured by them, and those servicemen cannot yet collect the benefits because the weapons didn't exist. And how can you collect benefits by being hurt by something that doesn't exist? Yeah, so again, but we did find them. As far as aiding terrorism, he paid $25,000 to each family whose son or daughter blew themselves up in a public place in Israel. He aided terrorists. But he kept order. He kept order. Again, if you don't like what I'm saying, but I don't like it either. But to answer your original question, we gave aid to a dictator over an elected official because we felt like the dictator could help us better. Well, Guatemala was plunged into a civil war, and this civil war was to last for many, many years. Now, in Cuba, there was a dictator in Cuba whom we did not like, so Castro overthrew him. Fidel Castro, and Castro was to govern Cuba till the day he died. Today, his brother runs Cuba. Raúl runs Cuba today. Castro turned to Moscow for help. Eisenhower decided he was going to overthrow the Castro government, but he didn't. Instead, he turned it over to the next president to overthrow the Castro. The next president couldn't do it. In the meantime, over in the Soviet Union, Stalin died under mysterious circumstances. There are persons who believe that Stalin was killed. According to the official report, though, that Stalin had a stroke. The stroke might have been caused by a .45 caliber or whatever else can cause strokes. But anyway, Stalin had a stroke. And he died a short time after into his stroke. There was a power struggle, and Khrushchev came on top. I hope I spelled that right. Khrushchev. Khrushchev. All right. Khrushchev was to govern the Soviet Union for the next, 12 years or so. Both Khrushchev and Eisenhower wanted to reduce the arms race. But the arms race was still going on. Now, here's what's, I'm old enough, but here's what scared the United States. The United States planned to launch a satellite into orbit in 1958. Fine, we did. But in 1957, the Soviet Union beat us to the punch by launching their satellite first. And this terrified a lot of American people. You mean the Soviets are ahead of us? Well, okay, yes. The Soviets got into space first, but they did it with inferior technology. In other words, from the beginning, they were inferior. And ultimately, this led to them losing the space race. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek because right now, the only way our astronauts can get to and from the Mir space station, the International Space Station, is using Soviet rockets. Now, we're trying to build our spacecraft, but it's like anything else like this you build new, you put it together and it doesn't work. You go try to figure out why it doesn't, it still doesn't work. Eventually you get what they call the bugs ironed out, but that takes some doing. But yeah, we have a private firm working on SpaceX and a big heavy rocket that can launch heavy weights into orbit and into hopefully take us to the moon and Mars. But the space race initially appeared to be being won by the Soviet Union. Eisenhower responded by creating NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which has been around ever since. All right. Eisenhower and Khrushchev wanted to reduce nuclear armaments, but in the meantime, an incident occurred, and we talked about this a lot when I was a kid. Francis Gary Powers, your book doesn't even give his name, so I won't write it down, was flying over the Soviet Union in a U-2 plane. Now, if you don't know, the U-2 plane had very, very large wings and could fly up to 68,000 feet. But Powers was flying over, and as he flew, he took pictures. And he had trouble and had to come down. But what he was supposed to have done was, when his plane came down, he was supposed to put a needle in his body that would have killed him. He decided he wouldn't do that. I mean, none of us know what we do, but his training called for he was supposed to have killed himself. So when the Soviets announced that we have your U-2 spy plane, Eisenhower just assumed that Powers was dead. So he said, we never sent him over there, we know nothing about it. And then all of a sudden the Soviet Union proved by irrefutable proof that Francis Gary Powers was very much alive and unhurt even. And Eisenhower was terribly embarrassed. Well, shortly afterwards, Eisenhower and Khrushchev met at a conference in Paris. The president of France, de Gaulle, Nikita Khrushchev, and Dwight Eisenhower, and the British Prime Minister met in Paris. They called the Summit Conference, where they was trying to reduce armaments. The conference blew up. Khrushchev wanted us to apologize. Ike said to his Secretary of State, Herter, we might apologize. Herter said, no, we don't have to, we shouldn't. Ike then refused to apologize. Finally, Khrushchev threw an insult at Ike, and Ike got up and walked out. The Summit Conference blew up. Didn't last long at all, and they had no agreement at all. Now, this is something that affects me personally because I have relatives who are farmers. My relatives are all forced out of the farming business. The small farm was replaced by the big farm. The small farmer had little chance. The bigger farmer had more help from the government. Your small farmers had to go find jobs to factory, do whatever they could. In 1949, again, another one of the things that started when I was born, the year going, televisions came to widespread use. Now, the TV cost about $100 a piece. And most homes only had one. They were black and white. The picture quality by today's standard was terrible. But people could get them by paying for them on the installment plan. You buy a TV and pay $10 a month for 12 months. All right. Or you could pay cash for it and get it for $100. You catch on, folk. Buying on the installment plan, you pay more in the long run, but the monthly payments are less. $10 a piece for a year, $120 your TV was paid for. Or you could, like I say, pay $100 and it was cheaper. Most of you probably know what I'm talking about. It's always cheaper to buy, almost always cheaper to buy right now, pay cash. But anyway, you could buy them on the installment plan. And most homes had them by 1950. Again, most of you are too young to know what I'm talking about. The old black and white tubes, the quality of the picture was really bad. And all of those, so the picture would tend to roll. I mean, the picture would go up or sometimes down, up and down, and very difficult to get it stable. But they became very popular. There were only about 2 or 3 channels you could get. This was before UHF was invented. So all you had was channels 2 through 11 before they had the other channels. And each person might be able to get like channel, well, we'd go to school and discuss at school, you know, which channels, you know, I get channels 2 and 5 and 10, or another person, we get channels 3 and 6 and 11, depending on where you live, but there wasn't that much pictures. So the kids would come to school having all watched the same program the night before. That is not true today, of course. People began to move into the suburbs. The South, oh yes, the South began to boom. Your book credits it due to the widespread use of air conditioners. Now, folk, maybe it's just me, but this room seems to be a little bit hot today. If it does to you, It is to me. Of course, maybe it's because I'm active and you're not. I know some of you are wearing your sweaters, which maybe you're cold. But the air conditioner has changed a lot. When I first went to the University of Tennessee, the library didn't have an air conditioner, and it was bad. Now, by the time I graduated in 1975, they did have an air conditioner in the library, but things were bad. But today, every public building is air conditioned. Most private homes are air conditioned. There was a population surge in the South.